The officers' club was alive with chatter and the clink of glasses. Uniforms pressed sharp and medals gleaming under the chandelier. At one corner table sat a woman, quiet, unassuming, her sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal the jagged scars that webbed across her forearm. The colonel spotted them and smirked, loud enough for others to hear. He sneered. "Looks like someone couldn't handle the battlefield. Must have been patched up by medics more than once." Laughter rippled through the room. The woman didn't flinch. She simply sipped her drink, eyes steady, calm. To the colonel, her silence felt like weakness. He pressed on, mocking her scars, saying real warriors wore medals, not mistakes carved into their skin. But then she shifted her sleeve higher. Gasps cut the laughter. Inked onto her arm, just above the scars, was a symbol every seasoned soldier recognized instantly: the Navy Cross. Not printed on paper, not hung in a shadow box, tattooed permanently into her flesh. The room went silent. The colonel's grin vanished. He realized, too late, that the woman he ridiculed wasn't a casualty of war, she was one of its legends. The air in the officers' club was thick with the scent of whiskey, cigar smoke, and triumphant arrogance. It was a space designed for relaxation, but tonight, as on many nights, it was a stage for performance. Senior officers, their chests heavy with medals and their faces flushed with drink, lounged in leather armchairs, a chorus of boastful laughter and self-congratulatory anecdotes. They recounted old campaigns, exaggerated their heroics, and reveled in a camaraderie forged in the crucible of war. To them, every battle was a story, and every scar a souvenir. At a small, round table in the corner, a figure sat quietly, unnoticed and uninvited. She was a guest of a junior officer, a woman named Anya. She was not in uniform, and her civilian clothes, though clean, were simple and devoid of any flair. Her hands rested on the table, and in the low light, the crisscrossing scars on her skin were visible, a quiet testament to a past she didn't discuss. She sipped her water, her gaze distant, as if she were a ghost haunting a memory. The conversation, a predictable rhythm of bravado, was led by Colonel Thorne, a man whose reputation for battlefield cunning was matched only by his cruel wit. He had just returned from a highly publicized campaign, and his ego was at its peak. He held court, and the other officers hung on his every word. "That last push was a mess," the colonel announced, a wide smile on his face. "But we fixed it. I always say, you can tell a good soldier by the kind of scars they carry." He raised his hand, gesturing to a faint, white line on his forearm. "A clean surgical scar. It means you were in the fight, but you knew how to stay out of trouble." The others laughed, raising their glasses in agreement. It was then that his gaze, cold and calculating, fell upon Anya. He noticed the scars on her hands and the quiet way she held herself. He saw not a person, but an opportunity, an easy target to elevate himself further. He gestured to her with his glass, and the room grew quiet with anticipation. "And what about our guest?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Looks like she's been through a few scraps of her own." The other officers turned to look at her, their drunken amusement turning into a morbid curiosity. "Those don't look like surgical scars. Those look like, well, like something you'd get from a back alley brawl." Anya stiffened, her gaze finally meeting his. She said nothing. The colonel, emboldened by her silence, continued to mock her. "I'll bet she's got a story to tell. Something about a fight in a bar, maybe. Or maybe she just fell down a flight of stairs." He laughed, and the laughter rippled through the room. He had turned her past into a public spectacle, a morbid joke for his and his colleagues' amusement. He was not just insulting her, he was invalidating her pain, reducing her experiences to something petty and insignificant. The room, which had been a place of camaraderie, had become a cage, and she was the prey. The colonel's words, a weapon in themselves, hit with the force of a physical blow, yet still, she remained silent, her quiet presence a stark contrast to the escalating cruelty. The colonel's initial mockery was a single, cruel jab, but it was just the opening salvo. Fueled by the cheap laughter of his colleagues, his comments escalated, transforming into a public inquisition designed to humiliate. He gestured to her with an air of theatrical pity. "Look at her," he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "She's quiet as a mouse. Maybe she's not used to being around real soldiers." A ripple of laughter followed, a chorus of compliance from men who were too used to following a leader's cue to question its cruelty. They weren't laughing out of true malice, but out of a comfortable habit of conforming. They saw an opportunity to be on the winning side of a joke, and they took it. The colonel, seeing no resistance from Anya, leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that still carried to every corner of the club. "I'll bet she didn't get those pretty scars in a firefight," he said, and the other officers leaned in, their morbid curiosity piqued. "She was probably carried through the missions. You know the type, the ones who are a liability, always in the way, needing to be saved." He shook his head slowly, a mock-somber expression on his face. Must have been a rough tour for the poor boys who had to look after her. The laughter that followed was louder this time, more confident. The officers, emboldened by the colonel's relentless attack, began to add their own cutting remarks. One man, a major, shouted, "Did you at least bring them coffee, sweetheart?" Another, a captain, chimed in, "Or were you just a damsel in distress waiting for a hero to show up?" Their comments were like a pack of dogs nipping at her heels, each one a little more vicious than the last. They had dehumanized her, turning her into a caricature of fragile, useless burden on the battlefield. Anya's silence was her only defense, a shield against their verbal assault. Her gaze remained distant, fixed on a point far beyond the club, beyond the room, beyond the moment. She didn't flinch, didn't respond, didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. The only sign of her struggle was the subtle tension in her hands as her knuckles whitened against the table's edge, a silent testament to the inner battle she was fighting. The colonel's words were a verbal version of the violence she had endured, a fresh wound on an old scar. He was not just mocking her, he was invalidating her pain, reducing her experiences to a cheap punchline. He had no idea that his words were hitting a far more accurate mark than he could ever have imagined. He thought he was painting her as weak and useless, but in his drunken cruelty, he was accidentally revealing a truth that she had spent years trying to conceal. His comments about being carried through missions and being a liability were not entirely wrong. In the war she had survived, the battlefield was not an open field but a hospital, and the enemy was not a rival army but a siege. The boys who had to look after her were not her squadmates but the wounded she had refused to leave behind. His words, intended to be a joke, were in fact a painful reminder of a past she could never escape, a past where survival had been a collective effort, and where her only weapons were her will and her medical kit. Her quiet presence was not a sign of weakness, but of a strength forged in the crucible of a war that he and his ilk, with their easy heroics and clean scars, could never truly understand. Anya's quiet composure was a fortress, but the colonel's cruel mockery was a relentless siege. He had called her a burden, a liability, a damsel in distress. She listened to the torrent of insults, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor running through her body. The officers, emboldened by their leader, chuckled and jeered, blissfully unaware of the profound pain they were inflicting. Then, with an elegant, almost theatrical calm, Anya lifted her hand. The laughter died down, replaced by a nervous, expectant quiet. She wasn't reaching for a glass or a napkin. She was reaching for her sleeve. With deliberate, painstaking slowness, she began to roll it up. The motion was a silent, powerful declaration. As the fabric of her civilian jacket crept up her arm, the scars that the colonel had mocked were revealed, inch by inch, but this time, they were not the focus. At the top of her forearm, just below her elbow, a tattoo came into view. It was a simple, yet impossibly profound image, the Navy Cross, etched in deep, bold ink. The room fell into a stunned, deafening silence. Every eye was fixed on the emblem. They all knew what it meant. It was the highest honor for a combat hero, a distinction reserved for acts of extreme valor and self-sacrifice. It wasn't given for a clean surgical scar or a well-planned campaign. It was given for courage in the face of death, for saving others at the cost of one's own safety. The laughter, the jeers, the cruel jokes, all of it vanished, replaced by a cold wave of shame and disbelief. Colonel Thorne, his face a mask of 1,000 emotions, stared at the tattoo, his smug expression collapsing into a look of abject horror. He had just mocked a Navy Cross recipient. He had called a hero a coward, a burden, a damsel in distress. The others, too, were frozen, their faces pale with a dawning realization of the monstrous mistake they had made. They hadn't been making fun of a Bacali brawler or a liability. They had been mocking a warrior, a hero, a person whose sacrifice was so great it was recognized by the highest echelons of military power. The silence stretched, suffocating and heavy with the weight of their collective judgment. Anya simply held her arms steady. The Navy Cross, a silent, powerful declaration of honor and sacrifice. It wasn't a boast. It was the truth. It was a refutation of every cruel word, a testament to a strength they could never comprehend. The scars, once a source of mockery, now told a different story. They were not from a brawl but from a battlefield. She finally lowered her sleeve, and the spell was broken. No one spoke. The colonel, humbled and humiliated, looked away. The other officers, their arrogance shattered, fidgeted uncomfortably in their seats. The club, once a stage for their bravado, had become a monument to their ignorance. They had made a terrible mistake. They had judged a book by its tattered cover, and the pages within held the story of a hero who had already survived the worst, and carried the scars to prove it. The air in the officers' club, once filled with a cacophony of drunken laughter, was now thick with an unbearable silence. The colonel, his face a mask of 1,000 emotions, tried to regain his composure. He cleared his throat, his gaze flicking from Anya's tattooed arm to the stunned faces of the men who had, just moments ago, been his eager audience. Well, he mumbled, a weak, pathetic attempt at a recovery. I didn't know. My mistake. The words fell flat, hollow in the cavernous space. The damage was done. His casual cruelty had been exposed for what it was, not a joke, but an act of profound ignorance and disrespect. He tried to change the subject, to move on as if nothing had happened, but the dynamics of the room had fundamentally shifted. The men who had laughed with him now looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and contempt. A man who had made a joke just moments before now spoke up, his voice low and laced with anger. A Navy Cross. Sir, the major said, his words a cold accusation. You just mocked a Navy Cross recipient. What kind of leader does that? Another officer, a captain, chimed in, his voice filled with newfound courage. She's not a recruit, Colonel. She's a hero. And you made a mockery of her sacrifice. The tide had turned. The men who had followed his lead out of habit were now turning on him, their anger a collective rebuke. They weren't just defending Anya. They were defending the very ideals they had sworn to uphold. The silence was a condemnation, the whispers a trial. The easy camaraderie of the club had been shattered, replaced by a cold, hard truth. Their leader was not the hero he pretended to be. Anya watched the drama unfold with a detached stillness. She had not sought this confrontation, had not intended to humiliate anyone. Her only goal was to expose the truth. When the room finally fell silent again, she spoke. Her voice was not loud or angry, but it was firm, and it carried the weight of a truth that no one in that room could dispute. Scars don't shame me, she said, her voice a steady, unwavering force. They're the proof I was there when it mattered. The words were a powerful declaration, a refutation of everything the colonel had said. He had treated her scars as a sign of weakness, of shame, of a past to be hidden. She was telling him, and everyone in that room, that they were a badge of honor. They were a testament to the battles she had fought, the people she had saved, and the person she had become. Her scars were not a sign of her past she had to hide. They were a part of a story she was now finally willing to tell. She continued, her voice holding the room captive. You see these scars and you think of weakness. I see them, and I remember a battlefield where I held on to the lives of my friends. I see them, and I remember a time when I had nothing but my hands to defend what I believed in. The colonel's face paled further. Her words, so calm and so direct, had the impact of a physical blow. He had thought himself a master of war, but he had no concept of the true battles she had fought. He had no concept of the sacrifices she had made. His clean, surgical scar was a mark of a brief skirmish. Her ragged, painful scars were the mark of a war he could never understand. The silence that followed was not born of shock, but of profound respect. The men in the room, once so eager to laugh at her, now saw her for what she was, a true hero. A warrior in the truest sense of the word, a person who had fought not for glory or medals, but for survival. The silence that followed Anya's words was a living thing, a profound and humbling presence in the room. The men who had laughed at her, who had followed the colonel's lead out of habit, now felt the full weight of their actions. The club atmosphere, once so loud and arrogant, had been transformed. No one mocked now. The casual cruelty that had defined the night had been replaced by a quiet, deep-seated respect. The colonel, once the alpha of the pack, was now a shamed, humbled man. He kept his head lowered, unable to meet the eyes of the men who had once revered him. His carefully constructed image of a decorated war hero was shattered, replaced by the grim reality of a bully who had mocked a true warrior. He had medals on his chest, but she had a medal on her skin, and in this moment, hers was worth more than 1,000 of his. The shame was a more potent punishment than any official reprimand. He had lost his honor, not on a battlefield, but in the casual, unguarded space of his own club. Anya watched for a moment. Then, with the same quiet dignity with which she had arrived, she turned and walked away. There was no theatrical exit, no fiery speech. She didn't seek an apology or a moment of glory. Her presence had already commanded more respect than any medal on the wall, more honor than any rank could bestow. As she passed, the officers straightened up, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and regret. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. They understood her victory was not in a public shaming, but in a silent, profound lesson. She had shown them that a warrior's strength is not defined by their bravado or their rank, but by their sacrifice and their resilience. She had taught them that honor is not something you wear on your uniform, but something you carry in your heart and on your skin. The door to the officers' club closed behind her with a soft click, but her presence lingered, an indelible mark on their consciousness. The club, once a sanctuary for their inflated egos, had become a monument to a truth they had tried to ignore. They would remember her, not just as the woman with the Navy Cross, but as the person who had shown them the true meaning of courage. Some medals shine on uniforms, others are carved into the skin and remembered forever.